This is the first time we have had Helen Moffett as a guest on our webinars, although we've had many years of collegial interactions and collaborations with Helen, but it's great to have her here joining us for the webinar. In fact, we are going to be collaborating, and Helen is going to be running a workshop under the All About Writing umbrella. I'll give you more details about that at the end of the webinar. Helen, and welcome. Helen wears many hats. She's an author, editor, academic, activist, and environmentalist. Of all of those, editing is her favorite. She started out as Oxford University Press Essays academic editor in 1994, and she's had the opportunity to work with manuscripts and exciting projects around the world with a focus on the African continent's brightest literary and academic writers. She's the mentoring editor for Short Story Day Africa Project and an author and editor for the Open Access Children's Literature NPO Book Dash. She's been on the other side of the desk as an author. She's written academic works, university textbooks, poetry collections, along with commercial fiction, notably the A Girl Walks In, Choose Your Own Erotic Adventure trilogy, which she co-wrote. And these have been translated into 21 languages, including Catalan and traditional Mandarin. Her debut novel, Charlotte, a Pride and Prejudice sequel, was published by Bonnier UK in 2020, and she's currently working on the follow-up. Okay, so Helen, it's wonderful to have you. Helen's going to talk in general, and then we're going to launch into your questions, which you sent in beforehand. So, Helen, over to you.
Hi, and thank you. And how lovely to be doing this at last. All About Writing, and I've been making, as you know, friendly waves at each other across the airwaves and in physical space, because Joanne and I live actually only a few kilometers apart for decades now. And I've been an admirer of her writing since you first started out with your first novel all those years ago. As Rosie has explained, the reason I thought that it would be fun to talk to you today and where I thought I could maybe be useful is that I'm not that unusual, but I'm a fairly rare bird in that I've been both sides of the desk. I've worked in publishing, I've worked as an editor, I've worked as a freelancer since 1997. I've had 30 years in the publishing industry, in and out, but I've also gone in and out of the academic environment. I taught in the UCT English department for 8 years before I went into publishing. Then I came out of publishing and went back to the African Gender Institute at UCT, the University of Cape Town, for several years. And I am also an author, and I've also written just about every kind of genre there is. So, and I've published internationally and locally, and I've published with tiny little indie publishing houses, and I've published with huge, great big commercial branches. So I am rather uniquely placed to answer lots of your very interesting questions. But the very first, given that we can only touch the tip of the tippiest icebergs in today's brief conversation, I'm just going to say some very general things, and then we'll weave in and out of your questions, and I'll address some of the things that I wish that would-be authors, even established authors and writers, knew before they actually engaged with the publishing side of the industry. And because we've got such limited time, I'm going to stick to some very, very, very broad principles that I think apply across the globe, regardless of what country you're in, because, by the way, every country has slightly different publishing logistics and rules, and you need to find out what those are. But I'm going to try and talk about the general ones that apply across the board. I also know that I've got just about everybody in my audience, from from writers who want to make the jump into being published authors, to really experienced authors, to professionals from inside the publishing industry. So welcome, and I hope that you'll find something that I have to say useful for all of you. So my first rule, and I believe that this applies right across all writing workshops, my first rule for all of you is that if you want to get a better grasp on how the publishing industry works and what the process of producing a book means and what it means to work with an editor, you need to read. You need to read and read and read and read voraciously. I nearly said vociferously, but yes, you can do that too. It means read aloud, really loudly. But you need to read as much as you possibly can. But there's a secret to how you do that reading, and I'll talk about that in a minute. The second thing is homework. Homework, homework, homework. You need to research the questions that interest you in publishing all the time. You need to have a basic grasp of how the publishing industry works as an industry, both as a bricks and mortar system whereby there's offices with staff and telephones, that ships books out to typesetters, that ships books out to printers, that ships books into warehouses, gets books from those warehouses into bookshops, as well as all of the electronic and online marketing platforms. You need to know as much about those systems and how they work as possible. And I'm going to tell you in a little while how best to do that homework. I have a cheat sheet for you. And the third thing, and this is the biggest difference I find between, when I swap sides of the desk, when I put on my author hat and my publishing hat, the biggest gap that happens between author and publisher, as an author, you are fixed on the work you are producing, whether it's a memoir, a piece of nonfiction, whether it's a biography, whether it's a novel, whether it's a short story collection, whether it's a poetry thing, that is your focus. You are focused on how can you make that as good as it can be, or maybe you're not even there yet. Maybe what you're doing is you're thinking, how can I make this true to my vision of what it is I'm trying to achieve? And even that answer is giving you a hint of the trouble that you might run into, because to produce the work of writing, by definition, you have to have tunnel vision. You have to be completely focused on that project and completely absorbed in its world. From the other side of the desk, from the publishing side of the desk, the first thing any publisher thinks about is not, oh, wow, is this a good book? Although that's very high up their list of priorities. Their first thought is, who is this book for? Who can we sell it to? And that's the big shift, especially for someone who's done a work on a fairly narrow topic. I had an absolutely fabulous writer the other day, experienced, list of books to her name, but struggling to find a publisher because her book was on the sea sponges of Greece. And it was exquisitely written, but the question then is, who is going to buy a book on sea sponges in Greece? And as it so turned out, there are niche markets for absolutely everything, but the publisher has to know about those niche markets. And what I tell all authors looking for a book deal is you need to be able to be absolutely crystal clear when you approach an agent or a publisher on who the book's intended audience is. You literally have to be able to picture those people in as much detail as possible. And this is one of the first things that I was taught when I went from a university environment where I'd been teaching in the English department to a publishing environment when I took up the editorship at Oxford University Press's Southern African branch. I would get these exquisite manuscripts. And I'd go, and the sales department would say, no, sorry. And I'd go in on my knees and I'd say, this is a really talented writer. This is the most exquisite writing. And they'd say, yes. And it's got an audience of about 7.5 people. Who are we going to market this book to? Who is it for? So that's my big thing. But my big takeaway that I would, and I talk about this in a great deal more detail when I teach more detailed seminars on writing, on editing and publishing, about how you establish an audience, how you find a market. And those two are not necessarily exactly the same thing. There's a big Venn diagram overlap. But for example, you might be writing for children of a certain age group. And let's say you're writing for the age group 0 to 5. There is such a category, by the way, in children's publishing, books for children 0 to 5 years. In other words, the assumption is that their parents want to start reading to children in their infancy. So, for example, that's not going to be the same as a market. Children of 0 to 5 aren't necessarily going to be buying books, and their parents aren't necessarily in a position to buy books for them. So then you start thinking about subsidiary markets, or sometimes very important markets, education departments, libraries, schools, NPOs, the cluster of different audiences and markets for books can be really rich and varied. And the more you know about it, the more you are able to write a submission letter that says, this book will be of interest to the following audiences and the following markets. And it also subtly shifts and changes how you present that book, how you present it first to an agent, if necessary, and then to a publisher. So that's basically my first 3 big takeaways, and I'll give you the cheat sheet on how you can make reading work for you in your quest for both an agent and a publisher a little later on when I answer those specific questions. But my big 3 takeaways are: you have to be reading really voraciously, especially in and around the topic you are hoping to be published in. There are very rare exceptions to this rule. Let's say you're a rugby coach and you want to write a biography. Then you get a professional ghostwriter and you sit down and you work with them. But generally, you need to read voraciously. That's the first takeaway. The second has now completely flown out of my mind, but it will come back to me. So I'll go straight on to number 3, which is write with an awareness of who your book is for and how you want it to land with them. Oh yes, and that takes me straight back to my second point, which I will also address in more detail a little later, which is how you research all of these issues that are going to come up. How do you research the publishing process, the agenting process, all of the bits and pieces, the practical details? So I think I'll hand over to Joanne right now.
Okay. All right. Well, we received all your lovely questions. Thank you. And I'm going to, we've put them together. Some questions cover similar ground. So in those cases, I will ask those questions together and allow Helen to answer them together. So I think I'll launch right in then. And here's one where I will ask 2 questions from 2 people because they're similar. Okay, so Charles, I'm close to finishing the draft of my first novel and was wondering, wondering, I'm living in Cape Town. Should I limit my search for an agent and or publisher to SA? Or would it make sense for me to cast the net wider to include, say, England and or American options as well, and why? And then Shirley asks, where does a literary agent come into the picture? I'm under the impression that finding an agent is the first step to publishing. If that's true, how does one go about finding an agent? Okay, Helen, over to you.
Right. Well, the answer to the agenting question is quite similar to some of the questions about first catch your publisher, finding your publisher. But the first thing to do is to establish the rules of engagement. If you want an international publisher, the chances of you finding one without an agent to act as an intermediary, to kind of go to the court of the kings and the queens, as it were, for you and say, your worship, here is this valuable manuscript in a gold casket. You will regret it forever if you don't sign this author immediately. In other words, you yourself may not show up at the castle gates and ask for the moat to be let down. You have to have an agent to act on your behalf. However, there are many exceptions to this rule, both internationally and nationally. First thing you find out is whether or not your country where you would like to find a publisher requires an agent in order to approach. Some do, some don't. In South Africa is one of those rare few countries where you do not need an agent. You can go directly to the publisher. No agent needs to get involved in the middle. However, if you are dreaming of both local and international publication, you will need an agent. And we do have not many, but a few good agents in this country. The main reason why there isn't a big agenting market in South Africa is because agents need to earn a living and they need to charge commission on such things as royalties and, well, certainly advances on royalties. And given the absolutely tiny, laughable, risible amounts of money to be made in South African publishing, and the fact that very few South African publishers are in a position to be able to offer their authors advances, it's not really a sustainable model. So that's why agents in this country are largely a matter of informal, well, why don't you go talk to X at Y? So for a lot of people who want to go straight to a publisher, if you're South African and you've identified publishers that are a close fit for your manuscript, check, and I'll get to this in a little bit later, but check what the approach requirements are from that publisher and then have at it. Go for it. You do not necessarily need an agent. You do need an agent if you are hoping for international publication, but once again, there are exceptions. There are very small and specialist kinds of books. For boutique publishers or tiny indie publishers, poetry publishers, for example, really require an agent to act as an intermediary because, once again, there is no money to be made in publishing. I am that very, very lucky person. I have a London-based agent, and I once said to him, am I allowed to, because of course my exclusive contract says I'm not allowed to show anything to anybody without running it by him first, sort of these are the deals. I said to him, can I approach poetry publishers directly, or do I have to go through you? And he said, Helen, writing poetry is like owning a yacht. It's a very expensive hobby. So he says, have at it. You can go and approach any poetry publisher anywhere in the world, wherever you like, whenever you like. So if you've written a very specialist book, if you've written a debut poetry collection, etc., you can look around the entire world. However, if you want to approach what they call one of the big five, or if you want to approach a commercial, traditional trade publisher, and I will unpack all of those terms, and you want to do so internationally, you have to first find an agent. And that's hard. I used to say to people who used to say to me, help me find an agent, I'd say, Google is your friend. Unfortunately, in the last 12 months, Google has stopped being any author's friend. It now posts sponsored links, and at least half of those sponsored links are rip-off or scam artists. And you need a lot of experience in the business to tell the good from the bad, and which can be trusted and which can't. But I have a secret weapon for you all. and it applies to the publishers as well. Instead of telling people to log on to Google and say, how do I find an agent? Although you can do that, however, my response then is don't click on any of the sponsored links. Do not. Look for the actual agencies that are reputable and have names, and then look at their submission process. Some of them, it's even harder to get a manuscript in front of a big international literary agency than it is to get it in front of the eyes of an editor at a big international publishing house. So follow approach instructions minutely. Nothing annoys agents and publishers more than, let's say, they have an open submissions period for, let's say, March and April of every single year, and somebody writes to them in July and ignores their open submission policy entirely. So always obey instructions, which will be on the website when approaching an agent or a publisher religiously. Okay, so how are you going to find this mythical beast? Your agent, those still asking that question. And it's the same as for finding a publisher. You go back to reading and reading and reading and reading and reading. But here's my tip. Read the acknowledgements of every book that you read. See who praises their agent most fulsomely. See if the same agents and agencies aren't getting mentioned over and over again. Then look them up online. Do not go to the sponsored links. Go direct to their websites. Find your way around their websites. Read absolutely everything that they've posted up online. Try to get a feel for them. And pay attention over years of reading. Who keeps their agent? You know, if you, for example, enjoy the works of a big commercial fiction author, check to see if they have stayed with their agent over years and decades, if they are thanking the same agent over and over again. Then you know they've got a good one. The other way this helps is that if you are writing in the category of fiction or nonfiction, or in the category of fiction that you like to read, that will give you a sense of who is presenting what sort of manuscript where. Learn about how the big trade fairs work. I hope this gives you something to be going on with, but one of my top secret tips is never, ever, ever skip the acknowledgements section of a piece of work. Always check it out. Okay, next question,
Thanks,
Jo.
Helen. Okay, so we'll move right on with Bonnie. Is it advisable to have your manuscript edited prior to submission to a traditional publisher? And if so, how do you find a suitably reputable editor who is prepared to work with a debut author?
Okay, this, I get this one a lot. To the first half of Bonnie's question, yes and no. It is a good idea to edit your novel before you send it to a publisher. It can, however, be an expensive waste of time, especially if you're inexperienced at working with an editor and you don't know what to expect. Once again, we are lucky in South Africa. We have an stellar, exceptionally high caliber of freelance editors everywhere. But there are still a few scam artists who will take your money and run. So the best thing is word of mouth. Once again, go back to those acknowledgement pages. See who look on the imprint page. If you think a book just reads flawlessly, don't assume that's just the author. Look on the imprint page and see who did the editing. Then flip over to the acknowledgements and see if the author thanks their editor and what they have to say about them. So that's one way to find a good editor. But remember that you don't necessarily have to have your draft edited before you send it to a publisher. A lot of people think, and I must admit that with good reason, because sometimes very inexperienced publishing staff will look at a manuscript that's full of, let's say, grammar and spelling errors and think, oh, sort of amateur writer, not going to read more than a few pages in. Actually, a more experienced publisher and editor knows that nothing matters less. We are interested in whether the character, the plot, the energy of the story grabs you from the get-go. We don't care if your verbs and subject don't match in number. Truly, you have no idea how easy that is to fix. So I think a lot of, especially beginners, pay someone a lot of money to make sure that there isn't a single grammar mistake. Whereas actually what the editor should be doing is saying, there is far too much backstory. You need to flesh out this character. You need much stronger story structure. You are digressing here, etc. So, in other words,
Helen, can I jump in there? Yes, I was going to say that in our experience, people think exactly as you say. They think that they need to get the grammar fixed up when actually they've only written a first draft. And what is important is to show it to someone who can give you a kind of structural edit, which is an assessment of where a story is strong and where it needs help in the characters, and as exactly as you say, do these scenes work, is there a lot of info dump, all of that stuff. And there are more people who do that. We at All About Writing, we do that for one. Okay, back to you. Sorry.
No, not at all. That's very helpful, because I was just about, this is once again where there's an obvious big Venn diagram overlap between platforms like yourself that support writers and editors. And we both work there's very little difference between a platform like All About Writing doing a manuscript assessment or review and saying, this character needs more backstory, the tension dissipates towards the end, there's this terrible plot hole, we never find out what happened to A, B, and C. There's very little difference between that and sending it to a development or structural editor, or sometimes what's called a beta reader, BETA, and asking them to go through it first. Now, there are ways and means, because this can be very expensive. You can send your manuscript in for assessment to a paid, reputable professional. You can also belong to a group of peers. I'm a great believer in setting up a small writing group, but giving each other tough love and basically reading each other's manuscripts on an I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine basis. So you've got a group of 4 or 5 people and you will swap manuscripts, and then you will give each other honest, brutally honest feedback, which is not, once again, it takes skill, because it's not actually about your tastes. It's about, are these characters compelling? I have found characters compelling that I have intensely disliked. And I haven't enjoyed reading the book for that reason. But once, once the sociopath has got their hooks in me, I have to know what they're going to do next. So you need someone who can distinguish between their personal taste and what works as a gripping read. And for that, once again, the only practice is to read and 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 read, and then read some more until you have a sense of what makes up those essential ingredients. So yes, I would always recommend that you do multiple drafts before you submit to a publisher. At the same time, there are publishing houses and outfits, like, for example, the Short Story Day Africa platform, where what we are looking for is raw talent. In other words, that spark that's buried under a mass of bad grammar or unnecessary backstory, but there's something there that that if you worked with and you developed and you mentored that writer, you'd be creating something fabulous for the future. So be aware that there are many ways of venturing into this. So that's the first part. Do you or don't you have something edited? I would simply say have it read by as many qualified eyes as possible. Pay if necessary or if you have the funds. Otherwise, do it on a mutual benefit basis. And then I've forgotten the second half of Bonnie's question.
It
But I
was,
think
if you want to find an editor, how do you find a reputable editor?
back to your acknowledgements and your imprint pages. And just in this country, word of mouth. And I'm assuming that you're not going to be trying to find an editor in Canada or New Zealand. So word of mouth works very well here in South Africa. Right, what's next?
Okay, next. Now I'm going to ask a whole lot of questions in one go. So Rich asks, do publishers work pro bono on occasion if the author doesn't have upfront finance? Drickus asks about short stories. He says he'd like to publish his first piece of writing, which is a short story. And then he says he's heard from several people you need an agent. I think we've answered that. I also inquired with the publisher last year for a quote on how much it would cost. And one said a publishing package is 5,175 Rand and a marketing package, another 5,000. And then he read that you actually should never pay a publisher without upfront without getting your book first. And then please explain this concept a bit further. Do I need to pay to get my books published? And does that get deducted from what you sell? Okay, and then Howard asks, I've written a series of interlinking short stories based on events during my life, which I'm considering submitting for publication as an autobiographical novel. It's written in a rather lyrical style, freewheeling and stream of consciousness way that I believe is unique. Okay, it's my concern is should it be sent to publishers? My idiosyncratic style may be diluted in the editing process to conform to some template which publishing companies consider to be a formula. Will my authentic voice be lost while the manuscript is bent and molded into a form which fits their view of what constitutes a well-constructed book? And then finally, Mugaro, what is the standard percentage that the writer should get, and how does the writer secure a possible deal with a publisher? So over to you, all about publishing.
Rush. I'm going to take about 10 minutes because I think this is the point where I need to talk a little bit about how publishing actually works and how it operates as a business and how it operates as a production model. First of all, as a general, my knee-jerk response to what happens, do publishers ever do work pro bono, and this person quoted me this much and this person quoted me that much. My knee-jerk response is utter, total horror. You should never, ever, ever have to pay to be published, ever, except, of course, as always, there are exceptions to the rule, and those are the various forms of self-publishing, and that is a matter for a whole set of seminars on itself. And I'll happily come back and talk about self-publishing and how there are at least 5 models of self-publishing, some of which are pure vanity projects, some of which are pure sort of like stripping money from the gullible, some of which are actually very valuable and worthwhile exercises, and that's actually a good way to invest in yourself. So there are so many different models for that, but the bottom line is you should not have to pay. There are very, very, very small indie publishers. I know of 2 here in South Africa who, after nearly beggaring themselves and collapsing, purely under workload, now say if you submit a manuscript, you have to pay an assessment fee. However, for that, you will get an honest assessment of your work. I know 2 publishing houses, indie publishing houses, that do that here, and that's because the total staff for each publishing house is 1 person. One of them produced a book along list, book along listee, and the next month they got, I think, 230 manuscripts. And there was one of them, one. And they basically had to say, well, I need to filter this somewhere. And the only way to filter this is to say, from now on, to submit the paper. But this is all very honestly and transparently explained up front. And it should be very clear that this is an assessment fee only, and you will get X for your buck. But generally what happens is that publishing, and let me explain a little bit about the business. These are the two things that nobody understands about publishing. Number one, it's a business like any other. Publishers produce books exactly the same way a fish factory will produce frozen fish fingers, or a shoe shop will produce Doc Martens. They make a product for sale. They have costs to meet, which need to be met, and they need to sell their product. I cannot tell you how often I encounter authors who think that publishers are somehow government funded, or they're NPOs, or they're charitable institutions, or they're cultural institutions, with very rare exceptions. Let's say that they're attached to, so let's say you're a university press attached to a federal or state university, and therefore the taxpayer is meeting some of those funds. But generally, publishers are not charities. They are not cultural institutions that reward excellence and talent by publishing their work. It doesn't matter how good you are, or for that matter, how commercial you are, depending on the kind of publisher. The question is, can I, if I make 2,000 units of this book stroke, box of fish fingers, stroke, pair of shoes, can I sell them all? What are the odds of my selling 2,000? This brings to the second truth about publishers, which is never understood. So the first is that they are deeply pragmatic people who have to cover costs every single month. And they have to cover those costs through book sales. So it's no good asking them to publish something that is not going to sell, in their opinion. And they are generally more expert on that than you. But this is the second weird thing. All publishers are gamblers. Nobody has ever hit on the perfect formula for a book guaranteed to sell. Nobody ever knows when they are going to produce a book that is going to be like the Harry Potter series, and we know now it's all sort of, it's publishing law now that I think J.K. Rowling was turned down by 21 publishers before Bloomsbury said yes. And then Bloomsbury, I'll tell you a little bit more about what they did with the enormous amounts of money they made. But the bottom line is that there is no formula. If there was, publishers would have locked onto it. So publishers spend their lives searching for the Holy Grail, that book that will not just recover costs, what's called washing its face. In other words, it will cover the costs spent on it, contribute to the running costs of that publishing house, the bricks and mortar cost of the warehouse, the lorries that deliver to the bookshops, the staff, the salaries, the electricity and the water bill, etc. Not all of this gets costed in, as well as the advance, if any, paid to the author. But generally the costs in getting the illustrations, the copyright, the index, the typesetting, the designer, the editor, all of that will get added up. There will be a budgetary meeting. The budget will be signed off. And the idea is that the book must cover that set of costs. And if the publisher doesn't envisage that happening, your book is not going to get published, and merit has got nothing to do with it. However, every publisher doing this thinks, what if, what if, what if? So do you remember, think back a few years ago, the Jake White rugby book? Penguin Random House basically off that book for, hang on a sec, I've disappeared. Basically, Penguin Random House ate off that book for several years. And this is what publishers hope for. At least this used to be the old publishing model, that a book would not only wash its face, but that somehow it would enable what's known as cross-subsidization. In other words, you make so much money out of one book that it enables you to subsidize books of merit and talent, especially by debut authors who couldn't otherwise get published and which aren't otherwise going to make any money. Unfortunately, as publishing houses got eaten up and eaten up and eaten up and eaten up by this great big sort of like whale swallowing minnow model of industrial capitalism, increasingly CFOs are looking at their tiny little publishing houses down somewhere 7 layers down in the conglomerate of 55 companies they own and saying, what rubbish is this? Since when are we producing items for sale that are running at a loss? No, I don't care that your sort of zillions of copies of Harry Potter mean that make so much money that we can now afford to publish these slight esoteric collections of poetry by debut 23-year-olds. So the publishing model itself is under serious threat from courtesy of capitalism, late capitalism models, whereby the notion is that profit, we're keeping that all to ourselves and the shareholders. We're not investing any of this profit in new talent or unusual projects or worthwhile projects or projects that we think are important for community building. So watch out for that. But it does mean that the traditional style of publishing is, first of all, it's a business. But second of all, it's a business in which people are constantly gambling. Nobody can ever know. You see, even with a new line of shoes, your market researchers can tell you how many pairs you're going to sell. Your fish fingers, you know perfectly well how many truckloads your suppliers are going to order. With books, you just don't know. I have had publishers in the family for decades, and I've worked in publishing for decades, and I've seen commercial and trade publishers say, let's do X for Christmas. It's a surefire bestseller. And the next thing they know, they've got 20,000 copies in the warehouse that just won't move. They've send it out all into the bookshops, and on the 15th of January, the bookshops send them all back and they say, we don't understand. Nobody would buy this. We thought everybody would want this for their Christmas stocking, but no, they don't. But you still are up against that model. And then, of course, you never know when something like a world pandemic will come along and completely upset the apple cart. The pandemic completely changed the face of UK publishing, for instance. Because remember, they went into strict lockdown and they stayed there for about 8 or 9 months, during which no books were printed and something like 30% of the bookstores in the country were shuttered. And when they all came back, when they all opened up again, they were operating on completely different business models. They were saying, give us a celebrity cookbook. No, we don't care about all the fabulous debut new fiction. Doesn't matter how badly we wanted to sell that stuff. We've got people now, on their last pennies. We need to sell. We can only stock books that we know 99% certainty will sell. So that's how the publishing industry works. And this is why you never, ever, ever approach a publisher and say, can I pay you to publish my book? It doesn't work like that. But you say, you have been on Google, all the sponsored links say, bring us your book. We'll submit it to this wonderful professional experience. We'll answer you all your questions. We'll even draw up for a separate fee, a marketing plan, etc. There are a couple of problems with this model. And one is that you are absolutely at the mercy of, you have no way of knowing except by doing very diligent research, whether you are in the hands of not necessarily scamsters, but people who are overpromising or not. Many of my friends run what's known as boutique publishing houses, where you do pay them to publish, but they work on what I think of as ethical principles, as in, for example, 2 of them that I know of will send the manuscript that you submit to them out for review. You pay for that and you pay handsomely for it, but you get an extremely detailed review back. The publisher themselves also reads the manuscript, and on the basis of their response and the reader's reports, they will say to you, sorry, It doesn't matter how much money you are prepared to throw at this. We're not publishing this because our brand of quality matters to us. There are, once again, exceptions within exceptions. You get a lot of publishers have managed, a lot of what I think of as indie publishers and even trad publishers, as traditional or commercial or trade publishers are known, do work on this model. No, they will have separate self-publishing imprints where you do pay, but the kind of the luster of being traditionally published rubs off on you. And everybody knows that that imprint is a self-publishing imprint, but everybody also knows that you're working with a team of people who traditionally publish and who know what they're doing and who know what they're about. For example, people who offer marketing plans are good and well. And I know quite a few indie publishers who work with specialist book marketers and basically people who have what 20 years ago, apologies to everybody under 45 in the room, would have had a fabulous Rolodex at their fingertips. They would have had the names and the numbers of absolutely everybody, every journalist, every festival, everybody connected with the book trade all around the country. So there are professional book marketers and they are very good. And for a very small publishing house that hasn't got the time or the energy or doesn't have a marketing department, those people are invaluable. But an awful lot of people, they can draw up the most fabulous marketing plan on paper. But if they don't have the respect and the buy-in of their peers in the industry, nobody's going to listen to them or look at their marketing plans. They're not going to be invited to literary festivals. Journalists aren't going to give column room in print media or space on radio programs, much less television. Sometimes they will, sometimes they won't. But that's why you never ever approach, especially not if you're an inexperienced author or a first-time author or a debut novelist or debut anything. It is not a good idea to start by self-publishing. Self-publishing, as I said, is a huge topic. We don't have time to do more than briskly skim the tops of those waves today. We can always come back to this again. And as I said, it's a whole thing. There are different kinds of self-publishing, but generally I recommend it for people who are deeply, deeply experienced in traditional publishing, because then you know what works and what doesn't. You've got to know the players in the industry, the editors, the typesetters, the designers, the illustrators, the printers, the distributors, the bookstores. When you have a really good handle on that entire network, then you can say, okay, I can replicate this. Or, okay, I can barter. I'll tell so-and-so, I'll edit 5 of her short stories if she'll design my cover for me. So you can work in quid pro quo ways, you can work in interesting and innovative ways. But my general advice on self-publishing is you should not be approaching a publisher with with the equivalent, once again, for everybody under 45, of a checkbook saying, where do I sign? Also, don't ever self-publish if you genuinely cannot afford to lose that money. It's fine if you're a captain of industry who's about to retire and wants, your life story told by a professional ghostwriter, and you've got 100,000 to drop on this. But I hear too many sad stories of people who say, oh, okay, yes, fine, I'm going to spend 30,000 self-publishing my first novel. And if I sell sort of 3,000 copies at 100 Rand each, my costs will be covered. 5 years later, guess what? They have 2,800 copies of their book in gathering dust in their garage. Because how did they get it into the shops? How do they physically distribute it? Books, especially print books, are that incredibly bad combination. They're both extremely unwieldy and heavy and difficult to handle, at the same time that they're extremely fragile and they become easily shop soil. So, and nobody ever thinks about these things. So so once again, I go back to my earlier point, which is research, 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 research. Find out as much about how the book industry, from nose to tail, works.
Helen,
Yes.
I think we need to move forward a little bit, but I think you've covered that. Right. I wanted to mention that, Claire, we won't answer your question because I think Helen has been talking a bit about self-publishing, but we will also, our next webinar, the April webinar, we will have Print on Demand coming as our guests, and they do offer many services for indie publishers, most notably getting books onto Take-A-Lot. But that in that webinar, we will talk a lot more specifically about the world of self-publishing. So I think we can leave that one because we don't have a lot of time left. So Helen, I'm going to go marching rapidly on. I think I will ask Jane's question now. I'm intending to publish a book that has many illustrations, mainly of paintings, some well-known. I know that using them is very expensive because of the price of permissions, but without them, my narrative doesn't make sense. Do you have any tips?
I have really only one, which is your homework is going to be researching copyright law. If the illustrations you are talking about are in the public domain, and that you can go in Google, go and copyright, image copyright permissions, any combination of those words, and study really, and really follow all of the links, avoiding the ones that say sponsored. But basically, you have to go and learn up on copyright laws. If you want to use current material, in other words, material that is not in the public domain, then yes, you are looking at a very, very expensive journey. And yes, I don't actually really know what to tell you because authors just have to knyp and betaal, to use the Afrikaans thing. And by the way, that's not just paintings. It's if you want to use quotations from song lyrics, works by other authors, etc. Always check whether something is still in the public domain or not, and be advised the laws on public domain are different for the UK and Europe and for North America. So, homework.
Okay, and then I'm going to just ask a couple of spheres questions and we'll answer just one or two of them, I think. She asks about where and how to publish memoir, short stories, professional articles. I don't think is your sphere, so let's leave that. And then she asks, are they writer-friendly in terms of the legal contracting, and does, does one require legal advice, etc.? And how do we conduct ourselves with publishers so that publishers will basically love us? So let's quickly answer those, and then we've got a couple of things to say at the end.
Well, the very short answer to that question is first catch your publisher. Until you've got a publishing deal, until you've got a publisher making noises and you reach a stage of being offered contracts, few things make a publisher back away as fast as somebody who wants to be published and who's submitting a manuscript saying, well, and what is my share of the royalty and how am I protected and should I contact a lawyer, etc. I'm telling you, they will drop your manuscript like a hot cake and pick up the next one. You find out about all that sort of thing, and you do find out about it, and you must find out, and you must do your due diligence after you have been offered a publishing contract, because they're generally bog standard. Nobody knows what the future holds. There are only two things that I ask authors to look for. In fact, one, I say, think twice before you give away your world rights. Just look at the paragraph that says what territories are you giving the publisher the right to publish in, and when and how do the rights revert to you? When the book is put out of print, or it's, the first print run is sold and the publisher decides not to reprint. Those are the only nitty-gritty things. You need to know, you need not to give away your right as the author in perpetuity, and you need not to give away your world rights just airily and grandly. By the way, most royalty percentages are incredibly low, and some publishers don't even offer royalties. I think that very few poetry publishers in this country still offer royalties. Many of them operate on the, well, not many, there are hardly any, but most of the few that remain operate on the principle that any money that is made by a poetry collection is put towards the printing and publication of the next poetry collection and the next and the next and the next. But you're not going to get rich out of the royalties. You can just forget that right now. So I hope that helps. What else?
I think that's fabulous. Helen, I think we can spend the last few minutes just saying a few things about us and what's next. I've mentioned that the April webinar will deal with self-publishing issues, so come along to that one, please. We will be sending out more information, but the workshop that Helen will be doing in collaboration with All About Writing will be on the 25th of May, which will be on editing generally, your general editing. Just a couple of last words about us, All About Writing, and the rest of the year. We offer these because we take joy in giving back to our community, and many of our community have been with us for many years, and we offer these free so that even people who can't afford to do anything else get information from these and our other free offerings. But we also offer creative writing courses that teach you the skills. We offer a mentoring program where we hold your hand through the process of writing a book and give feedback and a deadline and help you brainstorm a story into place so that your story is going somewhere when you begin. And that's, you can sign up for 6 months or a year. And we, those mentoring groups are lovely groups. There's a lot of interaction between people. So we offer mentoring. We also offer the wonderful writing holidays. Our Venice retreat in October is, at this stage, we have 2 spaces left, but one is penciled in for somebody. And so we might only have 1 space left. So if you are keen on Venice, please yell now. It's a retreat. We've been doing it since 2015, and I think people generally find it an incredibly rewarding and inspiring experience. And then closer to home for the South Africans among us, we in Venice, we get people from all over the world. So it's a very eclectic, and you don't have to be, and people who are, very experienced writers to people who are beginner writers. So everyone can come. And then also a collaboration, and I see Rick Melville is with us. And in July, we offer a memoir workshop over a weekend. That's in collaboration, me and Joanne Hitchens. And it's followed by a writing retreat for a week. And those are held there's Rick and his show. We hold it in the Karoo Art Hotel, the beautiful hotel in Barrydale. The food is fabulous. We go for chilly morning swims in the river, and then we work on writing. So the retreat is for anyone who wants to write anything. The workshop over the weekend is for people who want the skills to write memoir. Then you can come to both if you like. Attend the workshop, then stay on. That's also filling fast. So we, leap up and down and yell if you're keen on those. And we also offer the assessments. So if you want us to look at a full manuscript, we also offer a much more affordable offering, which is what we call a mini assessment, because from the a full synopsis and the first 5,000 words, we can tell an awful lot about what works and what doesn't work in your manuscript. It's very affordable, and it means you can take those comments that we give you and kind of use them to rewrite, to launch into a rewrite of the rest of your book. So that's another offering. And so that's just a little bit about us, but we are so happy to have you with us. And thank you, Helen, for being a wonderful guest. And yeah, I think that's it. Helen, have you got anything, last thing to say?
Just to say thank you very much. It's been lovely. I've so enjoyed myself. I'm so sorry I couldn't get to the questions asked during the session itself. You have to stop and read them separately, and there are just way too many. But I hope that I'll see you all at the workshop at the end of May, and then we can tackle some of these questions in a little bit more detail. In the meantime, you can also visit my website. It's very simple. There you are allowed to Google, just spell my name correctly, Helen Moffett, Moffett, and go to my plunge around. There are some blog posts on editing that you may find useful. Otherwise, I'll be talking to you about editing in about 2 months' time. Stay safe until then, and thank you for being here, and thank you all about.
I don't know if I mentioned that's a Saturday morning workshop, but on the 25th of May, yes. Fab. Okay, and the links to those things will be included in, you'll get a thank you email, you'll get a link to the recording, and anything else that we mentioned will be in that follow-up mail. So thank you everybody for joining us.
Bye, stay safe.